Well, hello everyone. This is Fadi, and I want to welcome you to a continuation of a video that we did recently with Dr. Bernie Power concerning the differences between the so-called the Hafs Qira'a or Hafs reading of the Quran, which is the most popular in the world today, and the other variant readings of the Quran. And of course, I would like to welcome Dr. Power to be right here with me in the studio. Welcome back, Dr. Power. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this important, really, video series, because it does highlight some problems in terms of the various text readings of the Quran, even though, as you know, Dr. Power, many of our Muslim friends are convinced that the Quran that we have in our hand today is an exact replica of the original Quran that was revealed allegedly 1400 years ago. And at the same time, they would also argue that it doesn't matter if you read in Hafs or Warsh or any of the other variant canonical readings, that they all have the same meaning, that they all will read exactly the same way. And obviously, you and I know that's a problem, actually. That is not really the reality of what you have uncovered, what I am uncovering in my own research, and what others before us and contemporary scholars also have uncovered in relationship to differences between the variant Quranic readings. With that in mind, please give our viewers one more time just a snippet about who you are and what do you do, and then we'll dive right into a continuation of that.
Yeah, so I lecture at the Melbourne School of Theology in Melbourne, Australia, and excuse me. Oh, excuse me. My particular area of research is on Quranic manuscripts, but also I do things on the life of Muhammad and the Hadith, and I teach Arabic, Quranic Arabic as well to my students. So those would be the particular areas that I'm working in.
Very good. Would you like for us to dive into the slides right away? And if you can just tell people what is it that we are going to show them from last time and today also.
Yeah. So what I've been doing is researching the differences between the various versions. So I have in my hand, and I sent a copy of this also to Fadi, which has got the 14 different Arabic versions of the Qira'ats, 14 different ones. And excuse me, I've been looking at the comparisons between these, talking about how they vary and particularly where they vary. So that's really what we'll be looking at today.
Could you open it for them so they can see what you mean by that? Just a sample, maybe a page or something like that.
Yeah. All right. So here, let me just pull one open here. Okay. So here's a page, and you can see here is the text from the Hafs version. So they use that as the kind of the standard, the gold standard. And then on the side here, they have all of the different variations from that. So you can see there's a verse number, and it's got listed there how the other 13 versions will vary from that. And I'll show you a page later on where we'll see how significant these are. So that's basically, it's, I bought it from an Islamic bookshop here in Australia. So it's freely available. You can buy it around the world. So
yes, and to add to what you just mentioned, there is actually an available free copy that is color coded of the 10 readings, 10 canonical readings, which I have access to, and they do exactly the same thing. They will show you the Hafs in the main text, and then how the different readers would have read certain words. And obviously, before we view your slides, I mean, what is the problem with these variant text readings from your own findings? I mean, our Muslim friends, by the way, will insist that there is no problem. In fact, let me read something for you and for our viewers right now, if you don't mind me doing so. Here is a website, for instance, and the website is titled this way. The website, it's a blog, and the blog is called Explore Islam. And the blog article says, "Has the Quran changed?" Question mark. and then they say 8 reasons why the original Quran is still in existence. And they start basically the article by stating the following: the Quran is the only Islamic scripture known to have been the same since its first revelation to Muhammad 1400 years ago and till now. But Dr. Power, is this a true statement?
No. Excuse me. And the problem is that scholars have known about this for 14 centuries. They have been debating this, Islamic scholars, and talking about it and writing about it. And somehow the rest of the Muslim community hasn't been informed. It's been hidden from them. They've been deceived about it. And so they go online foolishly making statements like that. In fact, with totally without any kind of knowledge or any evidence for those statements.
Yes, unfortunately, of course, and it ended up misleading many wonderful Muslim people who truly believe that their book is preserved, and the fact that they are following the truth that has been revealed from heaven. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead now and share the slides that you kindly basically sent to me, and we'll go from there. I will have it on the screen, and Dr. Power, you can just direct me to keep changing them one slide at a time. And I want to let our viewers know that the title that I used, initially we were going just to focus on Hafs versions, but I can tell you that today is a continuation of our previous video that we did. So you can call this part 2. I will correct the title after the conclusion of this live stream. And Lord willing, in the future, we're going to come back and focus only on variant text readings within the Hafs reading itself.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay.
All right. So I'm going to screen right here, and I will begin to share. There you go. So here is the first slide.
So jump down.
Are you able to see it?
Oh, yeah. It's just got a blank slide. So go to the next one.
Yeah, I am already at the next one now. I don't know if you can see.
Okay. It's telling me click to add title. So that's a blank slide. Maybe go to the one after that. Go to slide number 3. See if that comes up.
Okay. You still seeing the blank?
Yeah, still seeing the blank.
Yeah, I am already in slide number 2. So for some reason, it's not showing you. I don't know why. What about now?
No, still not doing anything. So maybe if you go to slideshow at the top.
Yeah, that's what I.
That's what it's doing. Okay, all right. So it's.
We're gonna stop sharing. Give me a second here. What about now? Are you able to see?
Okay, now you need to share the screen.
Give me a second. I'm gonna go back again and share the screen.
I should just point out to the listeners that it's not only Muslims who are deceived by that, but also non-Muslims. And in our street outreach, sometimes non-Muslims will say to me, oh, yes, the Bible has been changed, but the Quran has never been changed. So they've heard this story from Muslims, and so they're repeating it again without evidence. Yeah. So this first... Sorry.
You're able to see it now?
I can see it now, yeah, that's great, yeah. Yeah, so this first slide shows the material that we looked at last time. So you can see the 6 grey boxes which talk about the different canonization. Canonization simply means authorization. So when a book is canonical, it means that people accept it as a legitimate book. And so we can see Muhammad died, there was no Quran. 24 years later, Uthman does the first canonization where he codified the Qur'an. And then another 280 years later, a scholar named Ibn Mujahid has said, well, one version isn't enough because there were up to 50 versions floating around at that time. At least we should accept these other, these 7. The problem also with Uthman's version was that it had no dots in it, so you couldn't tell the difference between the consonants, and it had no vowels or markings in it. And so the next version comes along and it's got those included, but that's a quarter of a millennium later, it appears. And then another quarter of a millennium later, a couple of guys, Adani and Shatabi, they say, well, 7 isn't enough. We want to have we want you to accept 2 more copies, readers, or they call them qira'ats from those first 7, and so it now becomes those 7 plus another 14, 2 of each. And then another quarter of a century later, Ibn al-Jazari says, well, actually, we need to make it into 10 because 7 isn't enough. And so he adds those plus 2 readers from them, making it 30. And then another quarter of a century later, Dimyati, he adds in another 4. So they have 14. And that the one that I showed you there with the 14 versions here, that comes from Dimyati's canonization. And with each of those, they also have 2 readers. So go to the next slide.
Yeah, so I want to emphasize to people, please pay attention to the time spans. In other words, what Muslims say are either the 7 or the 10 or the 14 basically canonized readings. Notice the span in time. How in the world can someone know that in the year 1705 AD, these additional 4 basically were revealed to Muhammad? How come everybody else missed them for all of this time until you get to that particular person, which is, as you can see, about a long distance here, almost 1100 years between the time the Quran was revealed and this so-called 5th canonization. Here's the next slide.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Shadi Nasser, he uses the 5 canonizations. He doesn't put a Dimyati in his. He goes straight to the canonization. You can see the bottom box on the right-hand side, the 5th canonization, when Al-Azhar, the university in Cairo, accepted or proclaimed the 1923 edition of the Hafs version to be the canonical Qur'an. So he calls that the 5th canonization.
In other words, he's talking about the 1924 Cairo edition and calls that one the 5th canonization.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Okay. All right. So go to the next one. So you can see here the first canonization, the 7. This was 304 years after Muhammad died, and Hafs isn't even on the horizon. It was around there, but nobody thought that this was a book that needed to be taken seriously. And
you can see his teacher, right? His teacher, Asim, is here.
Yes, that's right. Yes, right. Yeah. Asim's version was there. That was one of the 7. And I compare that with the Muslim claim that the Bible wasn't canonized until the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, which was less than 300 years after Jesus. But 304 years after Muhammad died, Hafs' version isn't even on the list. Of course, the canonization, I don't believe that it was canonized at the Council of Nicaea. The church had accepted it centuries before. We have documents of that, of lists which have all the books in them. But the Quran is very much a latecomer historically to the issue of canonization.
Right.
Next week. Okay, so it's now 420 to 560 years after Muhammad, so half a millennium later, Hafs suddenly appears on one of the lists. And this was the list by Adani and Ashatabi. And it was one of the 2 readings from Asim. So they didn't even accept this was the only one or the best one. They just said this is one of the 2 options. But notice Aduri, you can see there in the red box, he's actually got 2 versions. So that if someone went to him and said, could you recite the Quran for me? He would say, well, I can recite the one that I heard from Abu Amr, or I can recite the one I heard from Al-Kisai, but they're actually different to the ones that I heard from them, because none of the reciters, the riwayats, were exactly the same as the qira'at, because we see variations. Each of them, they had 2 versions that came from them, but often these were 2 out of a dozen or even more of people that they could have chosen. But the people who are doing the canonizing chose these particular 2. Okay,
in other words, what you're saying, it's, and I hate to use this word, but it's truly laughable to say that the same person can end up reading 2 different versions of the Quran, and this very person, Ad-Duri, be convinced himself that both different versions are the same Quran.
Yeah, and I think, and Dr. Shadi Nasser points this out, this whole idea of there being only one Quran, which has never changed, it's a modern invention. It's bid'ah. They've made it up. The early scholars never believed that. They always believed that the Quran was a fluid text, that there were many versions. Muhammad recited lots of ways to different people. Uthman chose only one of them, but there were others before that he could have chosen and could have got his things. And from that time, people added in dots and vowels. And so it was always a very fluid document. That idea really didn't happen until maybe the 20th century or maybe the 19th. It's a very recent idea. Next one. Okay, so now we have 1,500 years, so it's nearly 800 years after Muhammad died. They're adding in a couple more, so 3 more readers and 6 more reciters. And again, the number of having 2 reciters per reader is a random figure. It could have been 10. It should have only been 1, because if you've got 2 readers, it's because they're different. That if they were identical, you wouldn't have the 2 readers, but there were various versions.
And I'm gonna quote here Dr. J. Smith. He would say, based on this, you have 20 readings now, because if you take the 10 and you add the transmitters, you have 20.
20. Yeah, in fact, you have 30, because you've got the originals. In some cases, we still have the originals. And in my table that you'll see later, I compare how we can find some of the places where they differed from what they heard. They said, the person I learned it from said this, but I think a better reading would be this, and they've changed it. And I can give you some examples of that. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we've got down to the full 14, and again, 2 readers of each of them. This makes 42 different Qur'ans, which Muslims at some stage have said these are all canonical. That means authentic versions of the Qur'an. And Hafs is just one of them. It wasn't that it was the best one. It wasn't the one that was the most popular or the one they thought to be the most reliable. It was just one of them. He was sitting there in the crowd. It was a bit like the beginning of a race. You've got all your contestants lined up, and you've got no idea who's going to win. And Hafs was there lining up with them.
Absolutely. And I want to just explain to people real quickly how the selection took place by at least Ibn Mujahid. He was looking at every region. What I mean by regions like Basra, Kufa, Damascus, Medina, Mecca, and he will focus on the most popular reading. But when it came to Kufa, Ibn Mujahid was stuck. He couldn't find a single person per se that was really popular. So he ended up selecting 3. Hafs was one of them, actually.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned before about Aduri having 2 versions. We also find amongst these 42 versions a couple of others. So you can see Al-Bazzi, see number 2 with Ibn Kathir. Al-Bazzi's got a tick. He also heard a version from Ibn Muhaysin. So again, he had 2 versions. And we also see Ibn Shanbuz had 2 versions as well. One he heard from Ibn Muhaysin, which again was different from the one that he had heard from that Al-Bazzi had, and he heard a second one from Al-Amash. So again, it wasn't unusual for a person. She'd say, which version do you want to hear today? And one day he'll recite from this person, another day he'd recite. So they had this understanding that the Quran wasn't just this fixed, unchanged version, because they could recite it in different ways.
That's right. And look at Aduri. Aduri pops up again for a 3rd time here.
Yes, yeah. So it's pretty amazing. Yeah, so he's got 3 versions that he can recite, plus he could also recite from the one that he'd heard, which wasn't the one that he was reciting. So he could come up with 6 different versions of the Quran if you asked him, and he'd say all of these are kind of canonical accepted versions. So it must have been a little bit confusing for his listeners to hear him. He'd had like a different reading for every day of the week, and he could have Fridays off. So it's pretty amazing. Okay, next one. So this is Yasser Qari, and if we've got time, we'll look at some of the things he said about the Quran. He says the Hafs An Asim is the one which is the most popular. 95% of the Muslim world The Warsh, only 3%, Qalun, Ad-Duri, and Ibn Amr. So there's Ad-Duri popping up there. In different places they were popular, and I've been to a lot of these places. So I've lived in Yemen, I've been to Sudan, I've been to Qatar and Libya. Yeah, and as I went into the bookshops, when you ask for a version of the Quran, they would sell you the most popular one. So that's where I got my versions from. Okay, so how different? So I've got the list there, and you can see in the table on the right-hand side the numbers 1 to 14. So some of them are qira'ats and some of them are riwayat. So some of them were derivations of a reciter that they'd heard before, and others were the original ones. So this is where I did my work from, and I used a couple of other sources as well. Next one.
Right.
So this was, and when I was trying to show you before, this is the text. You can see it, the white text there in the middle, which is the Hafs version, and in the margins on the side, which is most of the page, are the list of all the variants. In this one, there's two verses in the Hafs version and 24 variants that are found there from amongst the different Qur'an. So about 1.3 variants per verse. So it's not as though it just happens from time to time. There's probably more than one variant per verse all the way through the Qur'an.
So, I mean, that's of course interesting, and any reasonable person looking at this cannot really emphatically make a claim that the 1.3 variants per verse somehow existed in heaven. So what do you, Dr. Power, attribute this to? Is it a memory issue? Is it a freedom of expressing the meaning? What do you think could have caused this?
Yeah, both of those, but also corrections. So a person may have heard someone from another place reciting the Quran, and they thought that actually sounds better or grammatically makes more sense than the version that I heard, and so I'm going to put that version in. So there was, again, the freedom that people felt that they could change things around, which was pretty remarkable, considering they consider this to be, the literal word of Allah that has come down, and yet they were working pretty freely with it. So yeah, some of it was bad memory, interpretation, grammatical correction, all of those things.
So, Tesla, the electric car maker, they usually will send the owners who own Teslas what they call an over-the-air update. What you just shared with us, it's almost like on-the-fly update. The reader is like, oh, I like this actually, so I am going to change my way of saying it. That's why mine now is going to look different or going to sound different.
Yep. Next one. Okay, so I've just given you some of the one example of the words. This is the text that's on the side there. For those of you who can read Arabic, the word there on the right-hand side in the bold letter says alayhum, which means upon them, and it lists there the three readings. So there's Hamza, Yaqub, and El Amash. So those three use that, and the rest, El Baqun, which is the rest, used alayhim, which has the same meaning, but one of them is an incorrect thing. If I was marking one of my students and they wrote alayhum, I would mark it incorrectly because that's not grammatically how it should be. The meaning between these two is small. It sounds like it could just be a pronunciation difference, but one of them is grammatically incorrect.
Yes, that's the thing that is important, right? Because I was told growing up that the Quran is the model for the Arabic grammar. In fact, the Arabic grammar actually borrows from the way the Quran says, not the other way around. Yet Al-Tabari was really frustrated with examples like this.
The Egyptian, who was a former... Taha Hussein, the former Minister for Education, said, when I read the Quran, I feel like reaching for my red pen.
Yeah,
and
yeah, to make corrections. Yeah,
make
exactly.
corrections. Yeah. Anyway, all right, next one. So those ones are insignificant in terms of meaning, or they're significant in terms of revelation, because what did Allah actually, or what did Gabriel actually say to Muhammad? Well, we don't know. He said one of those two things, but in other ones, the variations are significant. So this is in Surah 258. You've got the word Yughfar, he is forgiven. Tughfar, she or it is forgiven. And Naghfir, we forgive. So according to the different versions they have, the differences are only dots and vowels, but they change the meanings. So who is it that's forgiving or being forgiven? Is it a he? Is it a masculine person or entity? Is it a she or a feminine entity? Or is it we, which is Allah? Usually the term that's used about quarter of the times that Allah speaks about himself in the Quran, he calls himself we. Who's doing the forgiving? And this does change the meaning. These are significant meanings.
Of course, and it changes also the like you said, who is the author of this forgiveness? Are we telling a story about someone that was forgiven, or is Allah Himself is saying we forgive?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, they may have felt they were forgiven by someone else, not by Allah. Okay, so how many variants are there? I went through and counted up in two of the surahs. In Surah 2, it's got 463 out of 286, so about 1.6 variants per verse. 7.6 of its words have variants, about 1 in 15 of the words. So every verse has got 1.5, and about every 15th word has a variant to it. In Surah 9, it's about 0.5. So if you average those two, we would expect somewhere between 5,000 and 9,000 variants per version. So this is the kind. The Quran's got about 6,200 verses, so an average of 1.5 variants. Some chapters have got more than others, but they're there. It's consistent all through the Quran.
And let us also be clear here that Surah 9, according to the standard Islamic narrative, is considered to be either the last or among the last two chapters that were revealed before the death of Muhammad. But yet we are finding that even towards the end, there are still variants, because you would think by the time you get to the last chapter that was revealed, people have mastered the art of memorizing, transmitting, knowing that this is the right way to pronounce things and so on and so forth. But this is pretty much thematic throughout the Quran itself.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, have a look at this one. So that number is too many for me to deal with. And so what I've done is just focused on those where there's a consonantal structural difference, which would reflect the differences in the text that Uthman produced. Uthman's version had no dots for consonants and no markings for vowels, but we can see with some of them there were consonantal structural differences. Even the skeleton of the rasm of the Quran, there were bits missed out or added in. And so this would reflect what had come out from Uthman. We already know that Uthman, when he sent out the versions, and we saw last time how many there were to the different cities, they differed. So they weren't the same. Their scribes obviously weren't very good at their job, and they made variations. The second one would be differences in meaning, where the transmitters have understood the text in different ways.
Right.
So what I did was to have this list, and you can see along the top there the rawayat, and then the qira'at first, and then the rawayat, all taken from this book on the 14 versions, because they also list the differences in the rawayat, and compared those with the Hafs. Wherever there is a tick on this table, that means it's different from the Hafs version. You can see in some of them, like in Surah, in verse 4, there's a little cross in the middle. That means that version, the riwayah, differed from the qira'at. So he heard it from the person and then he changed it. And we can see some of those. We'll see a few more. There's another one down there at verse 11. We'll look at a few more of those. So everyone wasn't 100% transmitting what they heard. They were sifting it through and making changes as they felt the need to. So as I went through, it started off as a small project. I'm down to 85 pages. I haven't quite finished yet, but there's just reams and reams of this material, and I'm only doing the significant ones. I'm not doing all the 5,000 to 9,000 of them. That would take me too long. I'm just going the ones where there's a difference in structure or a difference in meaning.
Very good.
And I'm down to 662 words where you get these significant numbers. I imagine that will grow over 700, maybe up to 800 as I go through. All right. Now, often the Hafs version didn't hold the majority view. Every time you see a tick, that means these versions differed from the Hafs. And I put in a whole lot of different verses where you can see Hafs had a minority view. Sometimes he was the only one who held that word. Everybody else differed. Everyone else thought, no, a different word. So you've got here the word there, they gather. So yajma'un. That's what's in the Hafs version, but most of them say tajma'un, and we'll look at the reason for that later on. So Hafs he wasn't always there with the majority. Sometimes he was a totally dissenting view.
Right, and you would think when something like this happens, and given that Hafs himself wasn't an early reader or transmitter, he was kind of like a second generation, if you wish. When you see that there is a majority who are insisting on reading it one way, you would think that that's the one that should be adapted.
Yes. Yep. So it didn't work democratically. It looked like Hafs eventually got all the votes, picked up all the delegates. Now, if you want to look at this, there is a website called Corpus Qur'anicum, and you go onto the homepage there, and you can click on the part which says variant readings, and it will give you all of the 5,000 to 9,000 of them. It goes through them all in detail. Again, that's a site that's been constantly updated, so they're adding in new things as they come across new texts. So again, these are serious Quranic scholars who are doing this work. But a little trick is to notice that the verse numbers vary amongst the versions. So when you're going through my particular table, you might look for that word and not find it under that verse. It could be in the next verse up or the next verse down. For example, some count, so the Hafs version has 286 verses in Surah 2, and the Hisham ibn Amr version has 285. Some count the Bismillah as the first verse by itself, but others include it as part of the next one. Now, this is a problem for Muslims who claim about the numerical miracles in the Quran, and I'm sure you've heard of this. People say the Quran is just full of numerical miracles, and this is a claim by Rashad Khalifa, who was probably the originator of this system. He says the total number of verses in the Quran is 6,346, which is 19 times 334. Well, that depends on how you count the verses and which version you use. If you use the Hafs version, you're going to get a different number of verses than if you use the Hisham version, and his system will fall apart.
Right, exactly.
So he claims, for example, Bismillah consists of 19 verses, and you count them there from the original text. But the Quran actually has two ways of spelling Bismillah. In the heading at the beginning of each one, they leave out the aleph, which is grammatically incorrect. And I've done this with my Arabic students. With Arabs, I write, if I wrote Bism like this, would that be correct? They'd say, no, it's missing an aleph. And in Surah 96, which was the first, according to Muslims, the first verse that was ever recorded, it says, Iqra bism rabbak. It does have the aleph in there. You can see it down there in the little yellow box.
That's right. So
the Quran actually has two ways of spelling the Bismillah. But Rashad Khalifa says, well, one of the miracles of the Quran is that Bismillah has 19 letters because he loves seeing the number 19.
Now, if my memory serves me right, Rashad Khalifa is also the founder of the Quran only movement. Is that correct?
He's one of them. Yes, yeah. So he has an organization. I think his is called Submission. He actually got assassinated.
Got assassinated, exactly. One time I went to the area where his mosque was, and I was told about the story as to why he was assassinated. Now, I was a Muslim at that time when I visited that area, and I actually felt, I hate to say it, I felt like relieved that a heretic was taken out, but now you look back and you say, wow, the guy was killed for trying to be creative, actually, about the Quran.
Yeah. They eventually caught the guy who did it. He's in prison now. So, okay, next one. It's a bit unfortunate that he chose the number 19 because the 19 occurs only once in the Quran, and it's a reference to the number of demons who are supervising the torture in hell. So it's not as though it's an auspicious number. It's not like 7, the perfect number, or anything. It's the number of demons that are there, and you can see the picture there of Muhammad going down to with Gabriel, and you can see the demons there in hell supervising torture, women being hung by their hair and set alight. But to get his system working, he has to take out 2 verses of the Quran. So he takes out the last 2 verses of Surah 9. And as Fadi mentioned before, these would have been maybe the last verses that were revealed. And if he takes them out, then his system works. But if he leaves them in there, then his system crumbles. And he talks about these as 2 false verses which are included. So we rely on that in order to see the miracle of the Quran, the numerical miracle of the Quran.
Yeah, and yet you have someone like, for instance, Dr. Shabir Ali, who is passionate about this.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and maybe he doesn't. I'm sure he is aware of the history of it, but yeah. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so we'll talk about Surah 9, then has different numbers of verses. In the Hafs version, it's got 129. In the Hisham Ibn Amir version, it's got 130. And Rashad Khalifa's has 127. So again, he's doing what other people have been doing in the past, just fiddling with the Quran to make it fit into the system that he wanted it to do.
That's right.
So some of them have missing words, and we talked there about, if you count the number of words, which Rashad Khalifa does, then he says you get a certain number. But some versions, the Hafs version in this verse in Surah 57:24 has the huwa, which is he, but the other versions don't have it. And again, Hafs is in a minority here. The Hisham, the Warsh versions don't have it. So again, he Hafs has included in something that the others don't include.
That's right, and really the addition of huwa is to emphasize basically the subject of the the focus here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in terms of the meaning, it doesn't make much difference to it. But if you're talking about a inspired word by word, letter by letter Quran, then this knocks that out of the water. The next one, here you've got missing letter words. For example, the Hafs version has a wa in Surah 5:53. The other 3 versions that are listed there don't have it. So at some stage in the pronunciation, someone dropped it out, or maybe someone added it in.
Right. I mean, the only difference that this wow could make is that if you're looking at a chronological revelation here, it almost like in a narrative that this is what happened next.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And also, if you're basing your numerical miracle system on it, you don't want these extra letters thrown in there because they'll put it out.
That's right.
Some have got extra letters, so Hafs not only has some that the others don't have, it's missing some that others do have. And here's the letter Dal that's missing in Surah 5:54, which is present in the Ibn Zakwan, Ibn Jammaz, and Warsh versions. So again, flexibility in terms of how they pronounce things and how they wrote them.
Right. This is a clear example of pronunciations. It seemed like the double D here, if we're gonna call it that way, is more basically popular or common than the one without it.
Yeah, in fact, it was grammatically correct. So if a person was writing that, they would need to put the extra dal in it according to the standard Arabic system to get a correct Arabic version. All right, next one. Sometimes they have different letters. So sometimes they have wa, which means and fa, which means so. The same verse in the different versions, and again, Hafs varies from these.
And that's true. Grammatically speaking, when you use the fa, which is in English the letter F, for instance, F-A, versus the wa or the wow, the fa here indicate a causation, so because of what happened before it, this is the outcome, technically speaking.
Yeah, so causation as opposed to conjunction. But the wa just adds together things. Fa says, because of this, then that.
Yeah.
Sometimes different words. So you have here in 3368, the Hafs version has kabiran, and the Warsh, Duri and Khalad versions have kathiran. So it's a difference between whether it's going to be a big curse or many curses.
That's right.
So they're getting cursed. In fact, I think Allah is doing the cursing. And whether He does it with one big one or a whole lot of them, that's the texts aren't sure about that. Singular versus plural. This one actually has some legal implications. So it's the verse about if a person misses their fast, what should they do? Should they feed?
Speaking of Ramadan, right?
Yeah, in Ramadan this month. Yeah, so if someone today has some food during the middle of the day, or has sex with their wife, then or husband, then they've broken their fast, and so they have to make it up. And the expiation for that is they have to feed either one poor person, miskinin, according to the Hafs, or masakinin, according to the other three versions, Ibn Dhakwan, Ibn Jammaz, and Warsh versions. So it's got legal implications.
Absolutely. Think about it. You're talking about a religion of works. You earn good deeds by the actions you do. So feeding, the plural in Arabic, meaning the minimum is 3 at least. So feeding, let's say, 3 poor people is different than feeding 1 poor person, obviously.
All right, have a look at the next one. In fact, one time a person came and he had sexual relations with his wife, and Muhammad said to him, feed 60 poor persons. So that he'd probably go, oh, could you give me the Hafs version on that, please, where it just said 1. And so this poor guy, now he's got to go out and give food to 60 poor people for just giving into temptation with his wife during the daytime. Should have waited till night. Ibn Amr says they had a choice to feed a poor person, and he says this verse is abrogated. So he's saying, well, even though it says that, it doesn't matter because this verse has now been cancelled out. Let's have a look at the next one. So it's got the same text up the top there. And Ibn Abbas says, this has not been abrogated. It refers to old men and old women who are not able to fast, so they should feed a poor person. So the problem with this was the poor people came to Muhammad and they said, well, this verse discriminates against us because a rich person can easily feed a poor person or 3 or 60 because they've got lots of money. But if we're poor, we don't have much money, then there's no way of us expiating the verse. And so the next verse appears to abrogate it. So it says, when the divine revelation, those who fast had a choice to feed a poor, was revealed, it was permissible to give up a ransom and give up fasting. So that was saying, well, look, I've got enough money. I don't have to fast through the whole of Ramadan. I can just keep eating and just keep paying poor people to go and get their food. But then it says the next verse came along and abrogated it. So there's this issue again within the text of which verses stand and which verses fall. Muslims
Right.
can't agree on the number of verses that are abrogated and which ones they are. And you've got groups like the Qadianis, the Ahmadiyyas, who say, well, actually, there is no such thing as abrogation in the Quran anyway. It was revealed perfect. It never needed to be changed. But most Muslims would believe that it went through various stages where it was the verses were cancelled. They were relevant for a time, and then they were cancelled and replaced with another verse.
Yeah.
Sometimes it changes a statement to a command. Here in the Hafs version, it says, you are not to be asked. It says, la tus'al. In other words, somebody else should not ask you about this. Or maybe Allah won't ask you about that. Probably other people here. But other verses then change it to a command which says, do not ask. In other words, Muhammad's being told, you are not allowed to ask about this. So who's this about? Is this Muhammad sitting there thinking nobody's going to ask me about this, or they shouldn't, or I'm not allowed to ask it? Either
That's
way,
right.
So the meaning really makes quite a difference in terms of what are the kind of limits under which Muhammad and the Muslims had to live. Confusing a noun with a preposition. So here in the Hafs version, it says, Alladhin hum ibadan rahim. So those are the slaves of the merciful one, and the Warsh and Hisham and Qutbul version say hum aladin aindil rahim. So those are the ones who are with the merciful one.
Yeah, those who are with Ar-Rahman, or those who are slaves or servant of Ar-Rahman. So big difference. Are they in his presence, meaning one you would expect to be either dead right now or in the future, versus servant of the merciful one?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and it's created some quite complicated exegesis from the commentators as well, as they try to work out what the verse means. And sometimes they'll say, well, another version says this, so we can take that into account and try and get a clearer extent. Okay, next one. All right. Okay. Sorry. So correcting grammatical errors. So you've got a verse in here which says it is accepted, and it refers to shafa'atan. So the intercession, which is a feminine noun. So therefore, it should have a feminine verb. This idea of gender agreement is an important one. Hafs gets it wrong, and the other ones I've got here, Al-Bazi, Al-Susi, and Ruh version, they actually have a different version which is grammatically correct. And we can plot these sometimes, and I mentioned before, sometimes a reciter would hear, a reader would hear it from a reciter, and they would say, actually, that's not correct, and they would change it so it was correct. And that's probably what we see here. So Hafs, maybe he wasn't very good with his grammar, and he didn't realize it wasn't right, or maybe he thought, well, I heard it this way, therefore I should just keep reciting it, even though I know it's grammatically incorrect.
That's right.
And the attempts to ensure there was only one Qur'an. We've got Caliph burnt his, and the Egyptians sank theirs. So by fire or by water, they would destroy the Qur'ans that they didn't agree with. And that's a thing that's been done by Islamic leaders at different times in history. Next one. This was a comment from Yasir Qadhi in 2020, a very famous one, this discussion he had with Muhammad Hijab. Every single student of knowledge knows, who studies ilm, or knowledge of the Quran, that the most difficult topics are the ahruf and qira'at, and the concepts of ahruf, and the reality of ahruf, and the relationship of mushaf and the ahruf, and the preservation of ahruf. Is it 1, or is it 3, or is it 7? I'm not sure where he gets those figures from. And the relationship of the qira'at to the ahruf. So if you're totally confused by this, so is Yasir Qadhi. He's got all these terms that are floating around. The definitions of them are not clear. and Muslims vary about this, like the term ahruf, people coming up with 40 different possible meanings of the term. And then how does that relate to the text that we have? And we've seen that there's multiple texts. And so he wasn't wanting to talk about this. If you can go to the next slide. I don't know, can you get this to play as a video?
I don't think I will be, but let me try. Maybe we can. Let me try and see. Yeah, the audio is not working.
Okay, all right. So this is what Muhammad Hijaz, if I were to give you a blank and tell you to write what is verbatim revealed on it, with no human interference, would you write something which corresponds with? And at this point, Yasir Qadhi jumps in and says, no, it's not it's not a simple yes or no. It's not enough for Muslims to believe. And Muhammad Hijaz says, well, it should be a simple yes or no. You're half of the Qur'an. And he said, can we talk about this? And Yasir Qadhi says, no, I won't talk with you about this on screen. Afterwards, we can close up and I'll talk with you. And then later on, Muhammad Hijab says, well, you need to talk about this because people want to know about it. And Yasir Qadhi says, well, I'll only speak with hikmah, but I can tell you the Quran is preserved and well known. It was passed down mutawatir. All of the qira'at are authentic. So he's saying every one of them is true, which doesn't quite fit. And Muhammad Hijab comes out. He says, no, but you should be able to tell. If I gave you a blank sheet of paper, what would you write down? And Yasir Qadhi says to him, well, what I would write down, so he finally gives in the third time, wouldn't be the same as the Quran that we have today. It would be a mixture. So there would be bits of one qira'ah of another one. And he says, I seek protection from Allah. He was so unhappy. He said, which qira'ah would it be? It wouldn't be just one. It'd be parts of this and parts of that. It's not going to be the Hafs version. So he says this. So he's not going to canonize the Hafs version. He says it will be some. He says it's coming in the 2nd or 3rd century. He said early on, the Muslims weren't agreed on it, but the one that I would write would be fully recognizable by everyone. But he says, are you certain that's the way that it was in early Medina, that a mixture of the qira'ats was accepted? That's what it looks like. We've seen that there were multiple versions floating around, but we're not really sure how they particularly looked at the thing there. And so the question that I asked, and he says, Hakada unzil, this is how it was revealed, but he's not willing to say what it was. But we've seen that there were multiple versions of the Quran floating around all throughout history, right from the very beginning. And it wasn't until 1924 that the Egyptians decided we're only going to have one version. Yasir Qadhi saying they probably made a mistake. And so his version has got bits of those, but it would really be the Quran, he says, really be the Quran. So I think that's probably where it ends up there. But you can go online and watch that, and we'll make these slides available so you can watch it. It was just a very, at the end, Muhammad Hijab said, oh, thank you, you've really clarified things for me. But he hasn't. He just made things much more muddy. And as a result, Yasir Qadhi and the criticism he received then went off social media for some time.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, this is my representation of what Yasir Qadhi is saying. He says, well, the Quran is a bit like a jigsaw, and we have to find the little bits from the different versions and put it together, and it won't be exactly the same as any one of those versions. Now, the implications of this are amazing, because what it means is the Quran that we have, and I've got the Hafs version here, is not the right version, and all of the other versions I've got here. So I've got the 14 in here. This one here is the Hisham version, my 26 version that you can see on the shelf there behind me. None of those is the correct version because it hasn't been put together yet. Someone has to sit down and do this jigsaw job of taking the bits from the Quran that are correct, the verses, and put them in, or the words that are correct, and put them in, and to make an authentic one, according to Yasir Qadhi. So it means that for 1400 years, no Muslim has ever been reciting the authentic Quran. So that's pretty sad, but that's basically the conclusion that he came to as a result. So if you can go on to the last slide, then we'll finish up. So just to conclude what we've talked about, there were many versions of the Quran that existed right from the beginning. Muhammad talked about 7 ahruf, but nobody really knows what he means. And we've got between 35 and 40 explanations of what this word ahruf means. Uthman tried to enforce a single version, but it was undotted. And also we saw that the versions that were sent out were different. The one that arrived in Kufa was different from the one that arrived in Damascus. His scribes didn't do a good job. They produced different versions, and then later on, people added in the dots and the vowels, resulting in somewhere between 50 to 75 versions, according to Muslim scholars. Ibn Mujahid decided this was too many, so he said, we will accept 7. Adani, a quarter of that, so that was 250 years later, and another 250 years later, Adani in the Shatibi says, well, we need to open this up, and we need to, Ibn al-Jazari opened this up, and so they added 2 to each of the earlier riwayats, and then they added another 3, and then another 4. And so we had 42 versions, but in 1924, Al-Azhar said only the Hafs version is the one that we'll accept, and they tried to destroy all of those. And Saudi Arabia is trying to do that now by economic means, so they're flooding the market with free versions of Hafs. And I've had friends in Yemen saying they came in and they took away all of our versions because they use a different one, and they put their Hafs versions in our mosque, free versions they gave to us. But it still hasn't solved the problem. We know the history, we know what's happened. It's all written up there in Islamic sources, and we see people like Yasser Qadi admitting that we shouldn't be talking about this in public. But as Christians, we're committed to the truth, and we follow that. That's why we're happy to talk about it.
Amen.
Yeah.
Do you want to go to the next one?
Actually, we could fit. How are we going for time?
Yeah. Okay. So we can stop right here, and
yeah.
I'm gonna stop sharing. So that was wonderful, brother. I appreciate all this, knowledge and the research that you have done. I am myself have benefited from your work in my own PhD research, and I saw a few things here today that piqued my interest. So we will be talking right after the show about that. But let me see. I wasn't able really to see any questions. If anyone has any questions for Dr. Power, please go ahead and point it out to me. Especially, I'm speaking to any of my moderators here. They can highlight it for me. But I'm going to go and see. But brother, tell us what else are you working on by way of research concerning the Qira'at, at least?
So this is the main one. The other thing that I'm looking at is grammatical errors within the Qur'an. So again, this is something that's been talked about for a long time, because the claim of Muslims is that the Qur'an is a perfect book. It's got no imperfections. And even the verse in Surah 384, which says 84, 82, talks about, if this had been from other than Allah, you would have found in it many contradictions. And we actually find within it grammatical errors that are found in one place but are not found in other places. And I've got over 100 of them. And so part of my reason for looking in the Qira'at was to see how different Qira'at corrected some of these mistakes. And I found a few cases of that. So places where you don't get proper noun-verb agreement, you get misspellings. The different Qira'at sometimes correct these because they were good Arabic scholars and they knew that the Quran, like Taha Hussein said, had mistakes in it. And so they were actually applying the red pen of correction to it. So that's some of the work that I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah. I am sorry, people can hear me, but probably won't be able to see my image at the moment. We're having some issue with my camera again. But all that to say, brother, is that thank you so much, of course, as always, for doing this. And I'm praying and hoping that by next time you will be able to find a few examples.
Hello,
Brother,
yep.
are you able to hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, do you have any last minute thoughts or anything you want to highlight? I guess what is the main conclusion that our audience can walk away with from what you shared today?
Yeah, I think you can have a confidence when you're talking with Muslims, and particularly when they say, well, look, there's been no change in the Quran. So, well, scholars have been looking at this for 14 centuries. It's not a new thing. It's not something that's been made up by the enemies of Islam, but it's something that has been mainstream within scholarship for all of that time, spread across the Muslim world. And often I'll say to them, look, your imams, your sheikhs have been misleading you. They haven't been telling you the full story, and you need to go and do some research and find it out. And now with people like Dr. Fadi and Dr, we're getting more of this stuff out, and I'm trying to put it out in a kind of a more popular, easily accessible way. So,
yeah. So we have really one question for me. I'm going to address you quickly, and one question I'm going to pass on to you. One person is making a comment. James Moreland is saying, talking, I think, about the Messiah in the future. There is a typo, I think, here. When he returns, is the Messiah going to combine all three books? I guess he's referring to the Quran, Injil, and the Torah. I'm not aware of such a thing, but would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think people need to understand that the presentation of the Messiah, of Jesus in the Quran, is really quite different from the one that we find in the Gospels, in the New Testament, and even the prophecies, the predictions in the Old Testament. The Jesus that's presented in the Quran is, I call him Jesus Light, Lite. They've taken away his identity. He's no longer the Son of God. He's no longer the second person of the Trinity. They say that he's just a man, even though he's a prophet, but not as great a prophet as Muhammad. And they've also taken away his work. Jesus said the Son of Man came to give his life as a ransom for many, and the Quran denies that. So they're turning Jesus into someone who either misunderstood who he was and what he was supposed to do, or who's someone who misled people. And I don't think either of those are legitimate conclusions. So to think that Jesus would come along to fulfill what the Quran or the Hadith say about him, I think is mistaken.
Yeah. There's another question by Rock Zalt. Where are the manuscripts? Now, Rock, if you're talking about the Quranic or early Quranic manuscripts, there are a number of them found throughout the world in different museums. Now, they are not complete Qurans. One might argue that the one in Turkey and the Topkapi Sarayat, they will tell you that that's the only complete Quran, but it is not. It's actually almost 98% of the Quran. It has more than 2,200 variants in it. Dr. Power, would you like to add to this?
Yes, that's right. And there are manuscripts for the later versions as well. Yeah, that you can access those. They're available in different places. Just go online and have a search for them. Yeah.
Yeah. Here's another question. How many versions of the Quran do we have currently? I think the jury is still out on that, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the number that I've heard, like currently, certainly I've got my list, my 26 that I've got versions of, and there may be some others which I haven't been able to access. Maybe in private collections people have them. These are the ones that are publicly available. But you can buy these in bookshops or even buy them online from Jordan or Lebanon. So just go on there and look for them, you'll find the Qur'ans available there, and even in some bookshops around the world, they'll have them. Yeah, so I'm not sure where we can get where we can find the other ones, but yeah.
Yeah. Here's a question for you, Dr. Power. People want to know where they can find some of your studies and findings. You have your own website?
I do, berniepower.com. So it's very easy to find. Yeah. And I've put up there a lot of the material that I've written, also the debates that I've done. I was supposed to do a debate with Muhammad Hijab last year, but his visa to Australia got refused. We had a venue and a topic and advertising, and then heard that he couldn't come. So that was a shame.
Yeah. Very good, brother. Well, thank you so much. It's a blessing really to have you with me here today and in the past. And I pray that we will continue to do this. These are very powerful examples, tangible examples, visual examples for people, and especially for our Muslim friends, hopefully to see for themselves and just ask the logical questions. How can this be the same Quran? It's just a logical question. And I think, I want to give Muhammad Hijab credit for asking these kind of questions. I mean, you can tell that he was disturbed by the answers, but he, of course, being live at that time and on the air, wanted to be respectful to Dr. Qadi and didn't want to appear to be argumentative, but the questions were logical questions and resulted, as you stated it correctly, in a disaster, unfortunately. Yeah. All right, brother. Well, thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to a continuation of this video series. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you for your questions. And you can continue, of course, to send us questions through the chat box, or you can go and visit Dr. Bernie Power, basically, website, and you'll be able to communicate with him there as well. Until next time, everyone, have a blessed day. Take care.
God bless.